There was a man in that building that nobody ever really looked at. He wore gray coveralls with a small embroidered patch above the breast pocket. He carried a toolbox that was older than half the executive team's marriages. He fixed elevators. He replaced fluorescent bulbs in hallways where vice presidents walked without looking up. He ate his lunch alone in the basement maintenance room every day at noon, always the same. A sandwich his 8-year-old daughter had packed for him that morning, always with a napkin note. He pretended embarrassed him but saved in his wallet anyway. Nobody knew his name unless something was broken. And something in this building was very broken indeed. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button before this story is over because what's coming in the next 5 parts will keep you up at night. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. This one is only getting started. The morning it all began, Ethan Cross arrived at Whitestone Dynamics at 6:43, 17 minutes before his shift technically started, which was a habit from a life he no longer talked about. The building was a 52-story glass tower in the financial district, the kind of structure that made you feel small when you stood at its base and looked up. Whitestone Dynamics occupied all of it. Pharmaceutical supply chains, defense logistics contracts, 6 subsidiaries operating across 4 continents. The company generated revenue that most small nations would envy. Its headquarters smelled like recycled air, expensive coffee, and the low electrical hum of servers that never slept. Ethan badged through the service entrance, same as always. The security guard at the desk, a heavy man named Rourke, who had the permanently suspicious expression of someone who'd been doing this job too long, barely glanced up. Cross. Morning, Rourke. Elevator 3 is making that noise again. I'll get to it. He didn't need Rourke to tell him about Elevator 3. He'd known about the harmonic resonance in its cable tensioner for 9 days, had ordered the replacement part through the proper maintenance request channel, and had watched that request sit in a digital queue while someone in facilities management ignored it. The elevator wasn't dangerous. It was just annoying. But Ethan had logged it, documented it, and followed up twice in writing. Because that's what you did when you understood that documentation was the only thing that protected you when something eventually went wrong. That instinct wasn't from the maintenance handbook. He took the service stairs down to the basement level, unlocked the maintenance room, and stood for a moment in the narrow space between metal shelving units loaded with spare parts, lubricant cans, circuit breakers, and the particular controlled chaos of a one-man operation keeping a 52-story building from falling apart. He set his toolbox on the work table, hung his jacket on the hook behind the door, and looked at the photograph taped to the edge of the shelf. Sophie, 8 years old, missing one front tooth in the picture, wearing the yellow raincoat she'd refused to give up for 2 consecutive winters, despite the fact that it was now several inches too short in the sleeves. She was laughing at something off camera. She laughed like that a lot. He touched the edge of the photo once, not a ritual, just a thing he did without thinking, and then turned to start his day. The 44th floor was where Ethan first noticed something wrong with Whitestone Dynamics. Not wrong in the sense of a faulty breaker or a ventilation blockage. Wrong in the way that he'd learned, over years in situations that had nothing to do with building maintenance, to recognize when the texture of a place shifted, when the people inside it started moving differently, when conversations stopped too quickly when someone walked past, when the same faces appeared in the same hallways at odd hours without obvious reason. He'd noticed it 14 months ago, not in dramatic fashion, not some sudden revelation, just a slow accumulation of things that didn't fit. A server room on the 44th floor that had been designated as a secondary archive but showed consistent power draw at 2 and 3 in the morning. A set of executive conference rooms that had, over 6 months, quietly had their standard security camera feeds rerouted to a private monitoring station that bypassed the building's central system. An encrypted access log for a restricted document storage area that showed a pattern of overnight entry by 3 individuals whose official job titles had nothing to do with document management. Ethan noticed these things because it was his job to know the building's infrastructure. The cameras, the power lines, the ventilation ducts, the server connections. All of it ran through systems he serviced. When something in those systems behaved in ways that contradicted its stated purpose, he saw it. Most maintenance workers would have shrugged it off, filed it as an IT problem, moved on. Ethan Cross was not most maintenance workers. He had started keeping a personal log 14 months ago. Nothing digital. He wasn't naive enough to log anything sensitive on a company system. A small, leather-bound notebook kept in the inner pocket of his jacket, filled with dates, times, location codes, and careful observations. He'd cross-referenced building access records against elevator usage logs, which he had legitimate access to as part of his daily work. He'd quietly documented every camera rerouting, every irregular power draw, every face that appeared somewhere it shouldn't have been. He hadn't gone to HR. He hadn't gone to building security. He hadn't gone to anyone because 14 months ago, he still wasn't sure what he was looking at. And because the one thing his former life had taught him, the thing he carried in his bones rather than his memory, was that you didn't expose yourself before you understood the full shape of what you were facing. He was still figuring out the full shape when Victoria Sterling walked into it. He saw her for the first time in an elevator. Not elevator 3, which was still waiting on its part, but elevator 7, the executive bank on the north side of the building. He was checking the inspection panel on the exterior housing when the doors opened and she stepped out, already on a call, already moving fast. She was younger than he'd expected for the CEO title. He knew her by reputation. Whitestone Dynamics' leadership change 18 months ago had been covered in enough business press that even people who didn't follow financial news had absorbed the basic facts. 30 years old. Promoted from inside the company. Took over from the founder's hand-picked successor after the board grew impatient with 3 consecutive quarters of flat growth. Aggressive turnaround strategy. Known for working 16-hour days and for having limited patience for meetings that could have been emails. In person, she was about what that profile suggested. Sharp eyes, the slightly compressed posture of someone who was always processing several things at once. A blazer that looked expensive in the way that genuine quality looks expensive rather than the way that performance looks expensive. She was talking into her phone in a clipped, focused tone, something about rescheduling a legal review, and she walked past Ethan without registering his existence, which was entirely normal and exactly how Ethan preferred it. He watched her go. Not out of any personal interest, just the habitual cataloging of people and movement that was as automatic to him as breathing. She turned left toward the executive suite wing. Her pace slowed slightly, which it hadn't done since she stepped off the elevator. She glanced once over her shoulder. Ethan turned back to the inspection panel. He filed it away. What? 2 weeks later, he filed away something else. He was in the maintenance access corridor on the 43rd floor, a narrow passage that ran behind the walls of the executive suite, housing ventilation controls and power junction boxes, when he heard voices through the wall. The executive conference rooms were acoustically sealed, but the maintenance corridors were not designed with privacy as a priority, and sound bled through in ways the conference room occupants never thought about. He wasn't trying to listen. He stopped because he recognized one of the voices, and because the tone of it stopped him cold. Marcus Hale, CFO. 54 years old, 22 years at Whitestone Dynamics, the kind of institutional fixture that every large corporation had, someone who had survived so many leadership changes that most people assumed the company couldn't function without him. Ethan had observed Hale in passing for 14 months without any particular alarm. He was arrogant, slightly dismissive of staff below a certain pay grade, and politically shrewd in the way that long-term corporate survivors tended to be. The voice on the other side of the wall right now did not sound like a politically shrewd corporate survivor carefully managing his image. It sounded like a man making a threat. Can't keep stalling. The legal review window closes in 8 days. If she pulls those internal filings before we've had a chance to... A second voice, lower, harder to make out. She doesn't know what she's looking at yet. That's what you said last month. Hale's voice, sharp. She's not an idiot, Paul. She's been running models on the subsidiary cash flows for 2 weeks. Legal counsel flagged it yesterday. Then we moved the timeline up. A pause. If we move the timeline up, Hale said, there's no margin for error. She's surrounded by people who are still loyal to her. Then we change that. We've been patient long enough. The voices dropped further, became indistinct, and Ethan stood very still in the maintenance corridor for a long moment. He took out his notebook. He wrote down the date, the time, the location code, and what he'd heard as close to verbatim as he could manage. Then he went back to work. Paul Garrett, VP of Strategic Development, 49 years old. Ethan added a star next to the name in his notebook that night, sitting at his kitchen table after Sophie was asleep, and stared at what he'd been building for 14 months. The shape was becoming clearer. Victoria Sterling discovered the irregularities on a Tuesday, which Ethan learned about on a Thursday because he was the one who fixed the emergency alert that had been quietly triggered in the document management system. It was a strange ticket, routed to him not because it was a physical infrastructure issue, but because whoever had designed Whitestone's building management system had linked certain security overrides to the facility's maintenance network, presumably so that a single person could address physical and digital lockouts in tandem. The alert indicated that an access restriction had been placed on a set of archived subsidiary financial reports that Victoria Sterling's account had attempted to open. She hadn't been locked out directly. It was subtler than that. The files had been moved to a compliance review queue, which meant they were technically accessible but would trigger an automatic notification to the legal and compliance team every time her credentials touched them. It was a surveillance flag, disguised as a bureaucratic process. Ethan sat in the server room on the 44th floor, the same room he'd flagged 14 months ago for its odd overnight power draw, and looked at the log. Whoever had placed the flag had done it at 11:58 p.m. the previous night. He cross-referenced it against the building access logs. One entry, North Executive Elevator Bank, 11:41 p.m. Marcus Hale's badge. Ethan sat with that for a moment. Then he did his job. He cleared the alert flag, which he was technically authorized to do as a facility's override, and he documented the action in the maintenance log with the precise technical language required, including the exact original parameters of the restriction before he removed it. He kept a copy of everything in his notebook. That night he looked at Sophie's school project spread across the kitchen table. Something about ecosystems, construction paper and markers, and a small clay model of a forest floor. And she looked up at him with that completely unguarded expression that 8-year-olds had when they weren't yet suspicious of being watched. "Dad, do you know what decomposers are?" "Yeah," he said. "They break down things that are dying and turn them into something the living can use." "That's kind of gross, but also kind of cool. Most important things are both." She went back to her project. He watched her for a moment, the careful, slightly too serious way she applied glue, the small furrow between her brows when she was concentrating. And he thought about the notebook in his jacket pocket, and the shape of what he'd spent 14 months building, and the fact that the CEO of this building was about to walk into something she didn't fully understand. He didn't sleep much that night. He introduced himself to Victoria Sterling the following Monday, which was not a careful strategic decision, so much as the result of being in the right place at the wrong time. She had been on the 44th floor. He hadn't known that. He'd been there to service the ventilation override panel, which had been throwing erratic readings for a week. He came around the corner of the main corridor and nearly collided with her, which startled them both. And in the half-second of awkward rearrangement that followed, she registered his coveralls in his toolbox and said, with the slightly distracted courtesy of someone operating on a high cognitive load, "Sorry, your maintenance?" "Yes, ma'am." Ethan Cross. She looked at him. Not long, maybe 2 seconds. But it was the look of someone who was actually paying attention rather than processing him as background scenery. He'd been in enough rooms with enough different kinds of people to know the difference. "You're the one who cleared the access flag on the 44th floor archive 3 days ago." He held very still. Not visibly. Not in any way she could have identified. But internally, everything went quiet and sharp. "That's right, facilities override. It was logged." "I know it was logged. I read the log." She paused. "Why were you in that system?" "Emergency alert routing. It's a quirk of the building management network. Certain digital security triggers run through facilities infrastructure. I get the tickets. I clear them." He held her gaze, kept his voice level. "You can pull my authorization credentials if you want to verify." She studied him for another moment. Whatever she was calculating, she seemed to reach some provisional conclusion because the sharp attention softened slightly, not into warmth, but into something more neutral. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years? Do you... She stopped. Started again, quieter. "The archive that triggered the alert. Do you know what was in it?" "I'm a maintenance technician, Ms. Sterling. I access the flag parameters, clear the flag, document the action. I don't open the files." A beat of silence. "Okay," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Cross." She walked away. He watched her go, and the same thing he'd noticed 2 weeks ago in the elevator was there again. The slight hesitation, the glance over her shoulder. But this time there was something else underneath it, not just wariness, something that looked like the beginning of fear. He went back to the ventilation panel. His hands were steady. They were always steady, regardless of what was happening inside. That steadiness was the one truly useful thing his former life had left him. He thought about the notebook. He thought about Sophie's napkin note from that morning, which had a drawing of a dog on it, even though they didn't have a dog, and which he'd already folded and put in his wallet. Then he picked up his wrench and got back to work. 3 days after their conversation on the 44th floor, Victoria Sterling sent Ethan Cross a work order. It was routed through the standard facilities request system, flagged as routine, a ventilation noise complaint in the executive suite's secondary conference room, the one they called Room 4B, which had a small attached anteroom that was technically listed in the building schematics as a storage closet, but had, at some point in the last 18 months, been converted into something resembling a private workspace. The conversion wasn't listed in any renovation permit Ethan had access to. He'd noticed it 8 months ago when he serviced the ductwork above it and found a second data cable running through the ceiling that hadn't been there before. He took the work order. He showed up at room 4B at the time listed in the ticket, knocked twice on the doorframe, announced himself as maintenance, and waited. Victoria opened the door herself, which told him immediately that whatever this was, it wasn't about ventilation. "Come in," she said. "Close it behind you." The room was small. A table, 2 chairs, a laptop, a whiteboard that had been wiped clean, but not quite clean enough. The ghost of a financial chart still visible in dry erase residue if you looked at the right angle. She stood on the far side of the table with her arms crossed, not aggressive, just contained. The posture of someone who had made a decision they weren't entirely comfortable with yet. "I looked you up," she said. "Ethan Cross. Maintenance technician, 3 years with the company. Before that, nothing. No employer history, no public records, nothing online. You're either the most private person on the planet or you've had your background scrubbed." "The ventilation noise is coming from a loose baffle plate in the duct above this room," Ethan said. "I can fix it in about 20 minutes. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking about ventilation." "I know." He set his toolbox down but didn't open it. "What did you find in the archive?" Something shifted behind her eyes. Surprise, quickly controlled. "How do you know I found anything?" "Because you wouldn't have read the maintenance log for a routine access flag unless you were already looking for something. And you wouldn't be in this room with the door closed talking to the maintenance guy. Unless whatever you found scared you enough to go looking for someone you thought couldn't be connected to the people who scared you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down, not because she was relaxed, but because she was a person who needed to think clearly, and she thought more clearly when she wasn't performing confidence. "Subsidiary cash flow irregularities," she said, "specifically in 3 overseas logistics subsidiaries. The numbers are off. Not dramatically, not in a way that would flag an automated audit, but consistently, in a pattern, over about 4 years." She paused. "Someone has been moving money. Not stealing it exactly. Redirecting it through intercompany loans and management fee structures that look legitimate until you run them against the original contract terms." "How much?" "Across 4 years, somewhere between 60 and 90 million. But that's not the part that worries me." "What's the part that worries you?" "The merger," she said. "The $800 million deal we're scheduled to finalize in 3 weeks. The acquiring company's valuation model is built partly on the projected cash flow from those same 3 subsidiaries. If the actual numbers are what I think they are, if the reported figures are inflated, then we're about to close a deal based on fraudulent representations." She looked at him. "And when that comes out, and it will come out, the only person in this building whose signature is on the merger documents is mine." Ethan had known the shape of this for months. Hearing it confirmed out loud had a different weight than seeing it in his notebook. He looked at the ghost of the financial chart on the whiteboard. Hale and Garrett. The name hit her like something physical. Not shock, she was past shock, but recognition, the particular exhaustion of a suspicion being confirmed. "What do you know about Hale and Garrett?" "Enough," he said, "and more than you'd expect from someone who fixes elevators." He pulled his jacket from his toolbox. He'd brought it down separately, folded, with the notebook inside, and he laid the notebook on the table in front of her. Not opened, just placed there. She looked at it, then up at him. 14 months, he said. I've been documenting what I see in this building. Camera reroutes, server access logs, after-hours activity, physical movement patterns. You don't have to trust me. You can read it yourself. She didn't open it immediately. She looked at him with the same 2-second attention he'd noticed before, and he understood what she was doing. Trying to read him the way he read buildings. Trying to figure out what he was. Why? She finally said. You're a maintenance technician. Why would you spend 14 months doing this? It was a fair question. He'd asked himself a version of it more than once. Because I noticed something wrong, and I don't do well with leaving wrong things alone. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. But it's what I've got right now. She opened the notebook. She read for 20 minutes while Ethan actually fixed the baffle plate because the noise was real, and it would have looked strange in the work log if he hadn't addressed it. He worked quietly above the dropped ceiling while she sat at the table below him, turning pages slowly, occasionally going back to reread something, not saying anything. When he came back down, she had the notebook open to a page dated 11 months ago. A detailed account of the camera rerouting he'd identified on the executive floor with the specific network node IDs listed. She was looking at it with an expression he couldn't quite classify, somewhere between impressed and troubled. These camera feeds, she said, you're saying they've been routed to a private monitoring station for over a year? Since before I flagged it, yes. I don't know when it started. And you know where the monitoring station is? Room 4C, he said. Next door. She went very still. The conversion wasn't permitted, he continued. Someone installed a secondary data line into what's officially a storage closet and set it up as a private viewing terminal. It's running off a power junction I service. I've seen the equipment when the access panel is open. He paused. They can watch every corridor on the executive floor, every elevator entry point, every door. She stood up slowly and walked to the wall separating room 4B from what was labeled on every official schematic as a storage closet. She put her hand flat against it, not for any practical reason, just the instinctive human response to understanding that something was on the other side of a surface you'd been near for months without knowing it. They've been watching me, she said. Most likely, yes. She turned around. The expression on her face now was cleaner than anything he'd seen from her. The performance layer stripped off, the executive composure set aside, just the raw and unadorned reality of a person who understood that the ground beneath them had been quietly removed. How many of them are there? I've confirmed 3 with direct involvement. Hale, Garrett, and a woman named Sandra Fitch in the legal and compliance team. There may be others I haven't been able to pin down. Fitch. Victoria's voice went flat. She's the one who processed the access flag on the archive file. I thought it was a system error. It wasn't. No. She picked up the notebook and handed it back to him. Okay, what do we do? We don't do anything yet, Ethan said. You go back to your normal schedule. You act exactly like someone who is slightly concerned about some financial irregularities she's looking into through proper channels. You do not change your behavior, you do not bring this to anyone in this building, and you do not access those archive files again from your office terminal. You're telling me to do nothing. I'm telling you to do nothing visible, he said. There's a difference. She gave him a long look. There was something in it he recognized. Not quite respect, not yet, but the grudging acknowledgement that came from a person who was used to being the smartest one in the room, running into a situation where that might not be entirely true. Why should I trust you? She asked, not hostile, genuinely asking. You probably shouldn't, not completely. He picked up his toolbox. But your other options are a company HR department that routes concerns to Marcus Hale's office, a legal team that has Sandra Fitch inside it, and a board that Hale has spent 22 years cultivating relationships with. He met her eyes. I'm the maintenance guy. Nobody's watching me. He left. She stood in room 4B alone for a few minutes, long enough that it would look on the corridor cameras, if they were being monitored, like she was reviewing something routine. Then she walked back to her office with the steady, purposeful stride of a CEO who had a full calendar and places to be. Ethan went down to the basement and sat at his work table with his notebook open and added 3 lines to his most recent entry. Then he called his sister, who picked Sophie up from school on days his shift ran long, and confirmed the pickup time, and listened for a moment to Sophie's voice in the background asking whether they were having pasta again, and felt the specific particular weight of having set something in motion that could not be easily stopped. Over the next 9 days, they developed a system. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the kind of thing that would look impressive laid out on a diagram. It was two people in a building full of watching eyes, passing information in the margins of legitimate interactions, communicating through work order routing and maintenance log entries that carried secondary meaning only to the two of them. Victoria started submitting facilities requests with specific detail codes that Ethan had shown her corresponded to actual maintenance issues he was already tracking, which gave him legitimate reasons to appear in specific locations at specific times. He in turn used the building's maintenance access routes, the service corridors, the utility floors, the ductwork passages that connected sections of the building most people never thought about, to gather information she couldn't access without creating a visible trail. It was slow. It was nerve-wracking in a low-grade, constant, exhausting way that Ethan was better equipped for than she was, because he had spent years in environments where the threat level was higher and the stakes were more immediately physical, and where the discipline required to not react to things you were reacting to internally was something you either developed or you didn't last. Victoria had a different kind of discipline, the boardroom kind, the kind that let you absorb a devastating quarter and walk out in front of analysts without letting it show. But it was being tested in ways it wasn't designed for. She held it together. She was better at it than he'd expected. There were cracks. On the fourth day of their arrangement, he ran into her in a service corridor on the 38th floor. She'd taken a wrong turn trying to find the secondary stairwell he'd described to her, and she had the look of someone running on too little sleep and too much unresolved adrenaline. "I keep thinking I'm imagining it," she said, without preamble, "that I'm making it into something it isn't. You're not. You don't know that. I have 14 months of documentation that says otherwise." He paused. "And I heard Hale and Garrett discussing the timeline directly. They know you're getting close." She leaned against the corridor wall, and for a moment the executive composure came down entirely. Not a breakdown, nothing dramatic, just a person being tired out loud. "I've been in this company for 6 years. Hale was the one who championed my promotion to the board. He gave a speech at my first shareholder meeting about the company's future." "People do that," Ethan said. "Does it get easier? Realizing someone is not what you thought they were?" He thought about that seriously rather than answering quickly. "No. You just get better at not letting it paralyze you." She looked at him with something that was more searching than any question she'd asked so far. "Who were you before?" "Someone who worked in places this isn't," he said. "That's as much as it matters right now." She didn't push it. She filed it away in the same efficient internal system that processed everything else. "Okay, what's next?" What was next was the discovery that the conspiracy was larger than Ethan had mapped. He found it in the server room on the 44th floor on a Tuesday morning, accessing the power management interface for a legitimate battery backup maintenance check. The system's internal audit trail, a low-level log that most IT staff didn't bother monitoring because it was buried 4 menus deep in the building management interface, showed a pattern of file transfers he hadn't seen before. Not from the archive system he'd already identified. From a separate network partition entirely, one that was officially designated as a legacy backup system for a subsidiary that had been dissolved 2 years ago. The dissolved subsidiary was still active. Not the legal entity. That was genuinely gone. But its data structure, its internal accounts framework, and critically, its banking integration had been quietly maintained inside the company's system by someone with both the access level and the technical knowledge to hide it in a place where routine audits wouldn't reach it. Ethan took photographs of the screen with a personal phone he'd brought for exactly this kind of documentation. Not his work phone, which was company-issued and company-monitored, but a prepaid device he kept in the inside pocket of his jacket, the same pocket where the notebook lived. He documented the partition name, the access timestamps, and the routing addresses visible in the transfer log. That night, after Sophie was asleep, homework done, dishes washed, the particular end-of-day quiet that his apartment only had after 8 p.m., he sat at his kitchen table and added the new information to a master document he'd been building for months, a parallel record of everything in his notebook laid out in chronological order with source notations. He'd printed previous versions and shredded them. He kept no digital copy on any device connected to a network. He thought about what Victoria had asked him in the corridor. Who were you? The honest answer was that he was someone who'd spent 11 years doing work that required him to be very good at a specific set of things and very willing to operate in the space between what was officially sanctioned and what was actually necessary. He'd been part of a unit that didn't appear in any organizational chart, that conducted operations in places the government didn't officially acknowledge having operations, that made decisions in real time without the option of kicking them up the chain. He'd been good at it. That was the honest and slightly uncomfortable truth. He'd been very good at it, and he'd liked parts of it in the way that you liked things you were built for. And then something had happened that changed the weight of what it cost him to be good at it. And he'd gotten out, and then his daughter's mother had gotten sick, and by the time Sophie was 4 years old, it was just the two of them. He didn't talk about it. Not because it was classified. Most of it was, technically, but that wasn't the reason. But because the gap between that life and the life of a man who packed his daughter's lunch and unclogged drains and kept a building functioning was wide enough that bridging it in conversation felt exhausting and pointless. He looked at the photograph he kept on the kitchen windowsill. Sophie at 6, before the front tooth came out, squinting into sunlight. He thought about what he'd set in motion by putting his notebook on that table in room 4B. Then he turned the light off and went to bed. Marcus Hale made his first direct move on the 12th day. It was sophisticated, which Ethan had expected, and it came through the HR system, which he hadn't quite anticipated. A formal complaint was filed against Victoria Sterling by 3 senior executive team members, alleging that she had accessed confidential legal and compliance files outside of proper authorization channels, had shared internal financial data with unauthorized parties, and had demonstrated conduct inconsistent with her fiduciary obligations to the board. The complaint was procedurally airtight. Every accusation was technically true in isolation. Victoria had accessed files, and she had shared information with an unauthorized party, namely Ethan, stripped of all context and reframed as misconduct rather than investigation. The filing triggered an automatic protocol that required the board's executive committee to acknowledge receipt and initiate a preliminary review, which effectively gave Hale and his allies a legitimate procedural basis for inserting themselves into Victoria's operations. Ethan heard about it 40 minutes after it was filed, not through official channels, but because the building management system processed the administrative lockdown order on Victoria's office as a physical access change. Her badge was flagged for secondary verification at her own office door, and the flag landed in his facilities queue as a routine security update requiring maintenance acknowledgement. He called her. Not on his work phone, on the prepaid. He'd given her the number on day 3 and told her it was the only number to use for anything that mattered. She picked up on the second ring. I saw it. Are you in your office? No, I'm in the parking structure, level 2. That was good. The parking structure had minimal camera coverage, and the maintenance access points were ones he'd specifically noted to her as unmonitored. Don't go back up. Not today. Meet me at the service entrance on the building's north side in 10 minutes. They filed a formal complaint, Ethan. It goes to the executive committee. Hale is on the executive committee. I know. They're going to use the review process to freeze me out while the merger vote goes forward. If I'm under a compliance review, I can't vote. I can't block anything. The only signatures that matter belong to the people who set this up. I know, he said again. So what do you do with I know? I come meet you at the North Service entrance, he said, and we stop reacting to what they're doing and start making them react to us. A silence. He heard the ambient echo of the parking structure, concrete and exhaust, and the distant sound of a car somewhere above. 10 minutes, she said. He was there in 8. She arrived at 9, her blazer slightly wrinkled in a way it never was during a normal workday. The controlled surface of her starting to show the accumulated stress in small physical tells. The set of her jaw, the way she held her hands. She looked at him and said nothing for a moment, just the fact of his being there, which seemed to count for something. Follow me, he said. He took her through the North Service corridor, down 2 maintenance stairwells, through the utility basement, and into a section of the building that existed on the official floor plans as an HVAC mechanical room, which it was, partially, but it was also the largest space in the building that had no cameras, no badge readers, no active monitoring of any kind, Because it was a room full of industrial equipment that Ethan serviced alone and that nobody else had reason to enter. He pulled out his notebook. He pulled out his phone. He laid out in front of her everything he'd found in the 44th floor server room, and then something he hadn't told her yet: a documented connection between the overseas logistics subsidiaries and a dormant holding company registered in a jurisdiction that had a bilateral treaty with the acquiring company in the merger. She stared at it. Then she sat down on a metal equipment housing and stared at it some more. "This isn't just a takeover," she said slowly. "They're not just trying to get rid of me and push through the merger. The merger itself—" She stopped, reformulating. "The acquiring company. They're connected to this, aren't they?" "I think so. I haven't confirmed the full picture." "If the acquiring company is in on it—" She stopped again. The implications were expanding faster than she could track them, and he could see her working through it, the financial architecture of it, assembling itself in her mind in real time. The fraudulent valuations benefit both sides. The executives here get rid of me, push through a deal based on inflated numbers, take their positions and payouts, and walk. The acquiring company gets a deal that looks expensive on paper, but has hidden advantages built in through the subsidiary structures. It's a coordinated extraction, Ethan said. Both sides are getting something. The company loses. The shareholders lose, and you get to be the face of the failure. She looked at him. There was no performance in her face right now at all. Just the raw, direct quality of a person confronting something genuinely large. "How long do we have before the merger vote?" she asked. 11 days. "And you can get me into the server room on 44? I can get you into the digital archive backups. There are secondary copies of the financial transfer records in a system partition I have physical access to through the power management interface." He paused. "It's not clean. Anything we pull that way has a chain of custody problem. A defense attorney could argue it was improperly obtained." "I'm not building a criminal case by myself," she said. "I need enough to take to the independent board members. The ones Hale doesn't control. There are 3 of them: Renata Voss, Philip Oduya, and James Croft. If I can get them what I have, they have the authority to call an emergency board session and freeze the vote independently of the executive committee process." It was a viable path. Narrow, and it required moving faster than Ethan was comfortable with, but viable. "Okay," he said, "but we have to assume that if Hale filed a complaint today, they're escalating. They're running out of timeline themselves." He looked at her steadily. "They're going to try to make the next move before we can make ours. So we need to be ready for them to do something we're not expecting." She met his eyes. "You say we like we're a team." "We are," he said. It came out simply, without qualification, and it surprised her slightly. He could tell from the small shift in her expression that she hadn't expected the flatness of it, the absence of hesitation. She nodded once. "All right. What do you need from me?" he told her. Outside the mechanical room, 32 floors above them, the building continued its daily operations, meetings and phone calls, and the endless circulation of people who moved through corridors without looking at the maintenance panels, the camera housings, the ductwork that connected every space to every other space. Marcus Hale sat in his office with his door closed and reviewed the complaint filing with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. He had no idea that the building itself, in all its mundane and overlooked infrastructure, had been working against him for 14 months. And he had no idea about the man who knew every inch of it. The thing about plans was that they assumed the other side was going to wait for you to execute them. Ethan had known this for most of his adult life. In environments far less comfortable than a 52-story corporate tower, he'd watched careful plans get compressed, distorted, and occasionally destroyed by the simple fact that an adversary was also moving, also thinking, also making decisions that your plan hadn't accounted for. The discipline wasn't in building a perfect plan. It was in building one flexible enough to survive contact with reality. On the 8th day before the merger vote, reality made contact. He was in the mechanical room at 6:15 in the morning, earlier than his shift, reviewing the server access photographs he'd taken of the 44th floor partition, when his prepaid phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. 3 words. They moved Garrett. He called her immediately. "What does that mean?" "Paul Garrett, his office. Overnight, they moved him from the 39th floor to the 46th, executive floor, the same floor as the primary secure conference suite." Her voice was steady but tight, the way it got when she was processing something fast. He now has badge access to the executive floor archive and the legal document vault, access that was just granted at 11:40 p.m. last night. Ethan thought about that. They're not waiting for the review process to freeze you out. They're moving the documents. That's what I think too. If they transfer the original merger documentation to the 46th floor vault, it goes under the jurisdiction of the Executive Compliance Protocol, which means any external request to access it requires sign-off from Hale. Hale, she confirmed, which meant the evidence trail they were building from the archived subsidiary records would have a hole in it. The merger documents themselves, the ones with the fraudulent valuations baked in, would become untouchable through any legitimate channel before they could get them to the independent board members. Without those documents, the financial transfer records were suggestive but not conclusive. They needed both. When does the transfer happen? I don't know, but they granted the access at 11 p.m. last night. They're not doing it during business hours. Too visible, which means either it already happened or it's happening tonight. Ethan looked at the photographs in his hand. It didn't happen last night. The partition access log would have shown cross-system activity if a document transfer that size had gone through. I would have seen a power draw spike. He paused. Tonight. They'll do it tonight. Can you stop it? No, but I can get there first. He was already running the building schematics in his head, the way he always did. The 46th floor layout assembling itself from memory. The vault's position relative to the ventilation access points. The power junction locations. The specific badge reader model on the vault anteroom door, which he'd serviced 7 months ago and whose firmware version he knew by heart. The vault door uses a secondary authentication that routes through the building management system. I have service-level access to that system. Ethan, her voice changed slightly. What are you thinking about doing? I'm thinking about getting into that vault before Garrett does and making a complete digital copy of every merger document in it. A beat of silence. That's not a maintenance task. No, he said, it isn't. Another silence, longer. He let her sit with it, because she needed to make this decision herself, and she needed to make it clearly, not under pressure from him. If you get caught in there, she finally said, it's not just your job. They'll pursue criminal charges. They have the resources, and they have the motivation. I know. And your daughter, I know, he said again, quieter. She went silent in a way that was different from her processing silences. Softer. You don't have to do this. This isn't your fight. I made it my fight 14 months ago when I started that notebook. He said it without drama, because it wasn't dramatic. It was just true. What time does your sister pick up Sophie? A pause. How do you know I have a sister? He'd found that in the building directory update from 2 years ago, an emergency contact form. Building records. She picks her up at 3:30. Then Sophie's covered. He stood up, already moving toward the mechanical room door. I need you to do something for me. Tonight, between 7 and 8 p.m., I need you to be visible, somewhere in the building with a clear camera sighting. Dinner in the executive dining room, a scheduled call in your office. Anything that creates a timestamp showing you were nowhere near the 46th floor. And where will you be? Doing maintenance, he said. He spent the day working, not as cover. There was genuine work to do, a pressure regulation issue in the water risers on floors 20 through 24, a lighting panel on floor 11 that had been throwing intermittent faults for a week. He did the work thoroughly and logged it carefully and spoke to the people he normally spoke to. Rourke at the security desk, a junior IT tech named Danny who occasionally helped him trace cable routes, a cleaning crew supervisor named Esperanza, who ran the evening shift and who sometimes saved him a cup of coffee from the break room on floor 6. He ate his lunch in the maintenance room at noon. Sophie had packed the bag that morning. She insisted on doing this herself, which she had started at age 7 and which Ethan had quickly learned not to interfere with, regardless of the results. Today was a peanut butter sandwich cut into triangles, an apple that she'd already sliced herself with supervised use of the kitchen knife, and a napkin note that said, in her careful second-grade handwriting, "Good luck with the elevator." He'd pointed out last week that elevator had a second E in it, and she'd said she knew she was using the alternate spelling, and he hadn't pushed it. He folded the napkin and put it in his wallet, same as always. At 3:45 p.m., he received a facilities alert. The badge reader on the 46th floor vault anteroom was reporting a firmware status request. Someone, almost certainly Garrett's assistant, preparing for the evening transfer, was querying the system to confirm the door hardware was operational. Ethan acknowledged the alert through the maintenance interface and sent back a status confirmation. He spent the next hour in the basement, preparing. What he was doing wasn't complicated in concept. The vault anteroom badge reader had a service mode, all of them did, because badge readers failed, and when they failed in secured areas, they needed to be serviceable without creating a complete lockout situation. The service mode was accessible via a hardware key that building management kept in a secured key cabinet, and also via a software override in the building management system, accessible from maintenance terminals with the right credentials. Ethan had the right credentials. He'd had them for 3 years. They were legitimate. What wasn't legitimate was the use he intended to make of them tonight. He'd made this choice already, back in the mechanical room that morning. He wasn't going to remake it now. He was just going to execute it as cleanly as possible and deal with the consequences afterward, which was, when he thought about it, a description of most of the decisions he'd made in his life that had mattered. He called his sister at 4:30. She answered on the third ring, slightly breathless. "Running late?" he asked. "Story of my life. Sophie's fine. She's in the kitchen. She's teaching my dog to sit, which is a lost cause, but she's committed to it. Can you keep her tonight? I'm going to be here late." A pause. "How late?" "I don't know. Potentially overnight." Another pause, longer. His sister knew him well enough to know that he didn't make this request lightly, and well enough to not ask the questions she might want to ask. "She doesn't have anything tomorrow morning until 9. "Thank you." "Ethan." Her voice shifted. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm good." He wasn't sure if that was true, but it was the only answer that was useful right now. At 7:12 p.m., Victoria sent him a text. In executive dining, visible. He acknowledged it and put the phone away. At 7:35 p.m., he was on the 46th floor. He'd come up through the maintenance stairwell on the north side, the one with no camera coverage between floors 38 and 47, a coverage gap he'd identified 9 months ago and documented in his notebook as a security vulnerability he'd never formally reported, because even then, without fully knowing why, he'd understood that information about unseen pathways was something worth keeping to himself. The executive floor at 7:35 p.m. was not empty, but it was quiet. The administrative staff who populated it during business hours were gone. The cleaning crew had finished at 6. The security desk at the floor's main elevator bank was staffed by a single guard who rotated on a 90-minute patrol pattern. Ethan knew the pattern because it was listed in the building's security protocol documentation that he had legitimate access to for emergency egress planning purposes. The vault anteroom was at the far end of the floor's east wing, past the executive conference suite and a row of closed senior partner offices. Ethan moved through the corridor with the unhurried, purposeful stride of a person who belonged where he was. Not rushing, not skulking, just a maintenance worker in gray coveralls with a toolbox, which was what he was, technically. Still. He reached the anteroom. The badge reader panel glowed its standard green standby on the wall beside the door. He set his toolbox on the floor, opened it, and retrieved the maintenance terminal adapter, a small device that plugged into the hardware service port on the reader's back panel. He'd legitimately used this device dozens of times for firmware updates and hardware diagnostics. Tonight he used it to put the reader into service mode, which bypassed the primary authentication protocol and allowed the door to operate on a maintenance override. The door opened. He went in. The vault itself was a climate-controlled room about twice the size of a large walk-in closet, with metal shelving along 2 walls and a document digitization station in the corner, a scanner rig with a dedicated workstation that was used by authorized staff to create digital copies of physical documents for the compliant archiving system. Next to it, and this was the thing that made the whole night viable, was a secondary terminal connected to the internal document management network. Ethan sat down at the terminal, plugged in an encrypted external drive he'd brought, and began working. He wasn't hacking. That was important to understand, not for any legal reason, since what he was doing was unauthorized regardless, but because it shaped how he did it. He had maintenance-level access to the building management system, which included the document digitization station's backup interface, which was a low-priority network node that IT had connected to the building management system for remote status monitoring. It wasn't meant as a data access point, but the connection existed, and through it, with the right navigation, he could reach the document vault's archived holdings. He found the merger documentation file set, 17 documents, totaling 432 pages. He started the copy. While it ran, he sat in the quiet of the vault and did not think about what happened if the patrol guard deviated from his pattern. He did not think about what Garrett might do if he arrived early for the transfer. He did not think about Sophie asking Ethan's sister's dog to sit, over and over, with the patient certainty of a child who believed that persistence was always eventually rewarded. He thought about the shape of the thing he'd been building for 14 months, and about how it was almost fully assembled now, and about the fact that once he walked out of this room with that drive in his pocket, there was no version of events in which this stayed quiet. The copy finished. 41 minutes. He pulled the drive, closed the terminal session, removed the adapter from the badge reader as he exited, and let the door close and resecure behind him. He stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, listening. Nothing moved. He picked up his toolbox and walked back the way he'd come. At 8:22 p.m., he was back in the basement maintenance room. He plugged the drive into his personal laptop, not company equipment, a personal machine he'd brought in his bag, and verified the file transfer. All 17 documents were there, intact, readable. He sent Victoria a text. Done. Meet tomorrow 7 a.m. mechanical room. Her response came 4 minutes later. Understood. Then, after a pause, thank you. He sat with that for a moment. Then he packed up, logged a credible overtime maintenance task in the work system, and left the building. The following morning, she sat across from him at the work table in the mechanical room with the laptop open between them, and they went through the merger documents together. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes, and by the end of it, the shape of what Hale, Garrett, and their associates had constructed over 4 years was laid out in its full architecture. It was in its way impressive. Not morally. There was nothing impressive about systematic fraud dressed up in corporate language. But technically, the construction of it, the patience, the number of moving pieces that had to be coordinated across multiple entities, multiple jurisdictions, multiple years, in a way that presented a clean face to any single reviewer, while concealing the full picture from anyone who only had access to one part of it. They've been building toward this merger specifically, Victoria said. She had a yellow legal pad in front of her with handwritten notes. She'd switched to paper the day they started working together, because Ethan had pointed out early on that anything she created digitally in this building was potentially visible. The subsidiary structures, the cash flow manipulation, the dormant holding company, it all connects to the acquiring company's ownership structure. Look at this. She pointed to a page. The acquiring company's parent entity, here in the ownership disclosure annex, this holding company. It's registered in a different name than the one in Ethan's server room photographs, but the registered agent address is identical. Same entity, different registration, Ethan said. Shell within a shell. The money that's been redirected through the logistics subsidiaries over 4 years ends up, eventually, in an entity that is effectively a co-owner of the company that's supposedly acquiring us at arm's length. She set her pen down. This isn't a merger. It's a controlled asset transfer. Both sides of the table are the same side. And you end up holding the liability. I end up holding everything that goes wrong. The inflated valuations, the misrepresented subsidiary performance, the undisclosed related party relationships, all of it sits on the CEO's desk when it unravels, which it would have within 18 months, 2 years at most. She was quiet for a moment. They needed me to sign because my signature gave it legitimacy, and they needed me gone before I figured out what I was signing. Ethan nodded. He'd understood the broad shape of this for weeks, but hearing it spoken aloud in its full specificity had a different weight. The weight of something that had been abstract becoming concrete and real and cold. We need to move fast, he said. If Garrett goes to the vault tonight and finds the documents in the same position, but the terminal's session log shows activity, how long do we have? I cleared the session log, but the building management system keeps a secondary activity record that I don't have access to delete. If IT does a manual audit, they'll find it. I'd give it 48 to 72 hours before someone looks. The merger vote is in 7 days. Yes. And we need to reach Voss, Oduya, And Croft, before Hale has any reason to know we're moving. She picked up her pen again and turned to a fresh page. I have Renata Voss's personal cell. She and I have had a direct relationship since before I became CEO. She was the one independent director who pushed hardest for my appointment. I trust her. If she reads what we have, don't send it digitally. I wasn't going to. She looked at him. Can you get me out of this building without going through the main lobby? I can get you to the parking structure's street-level exit on the east side. It's not on the primary camera network. Then I'll call Renata from my car. She was writing quickly now, the legal pad filling up. We need to package this in a way that's immediately intelligible to her. She's not a financial forensics specialist, but she's sharp, and she'll have access to counsel. Keep the first communication verbal. Tell her only enough to make her take a face-to-face meeting. Don't transmit documents until you're meeting in person, somewhere that isn't here. She nodded, still writing. Then she stopped and looked up at him with a directness that had become familiar over the past 2 weeks. The look she had when she was about to say something she'd been holding. When this is over, and it goes the way I think it's going to go, there will be questions about how we got this information. The vault access. The server room photographs. All of it. I know. My lawyers will advise me on how to characterize it. I can't promise what that characterization will look like. I'm not asking for promises, he said. I know you're not. She held his gaze. I'm telling you anyway, because you've been straight with me, and I'm going to be straight with you. He appreciated that more than he would have said. What I did in that vault, that's on me. Whatever comes from it is on me. You didn't know the specifics. I knew enough. Victoria. He said her name directly, without the slight formality that had characterized most of their interactions. You didn't ask me to go into that vault. I made that call. That matters. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the particular expression of someone absorbing something they hadn't expected. Then she nodded, once, and turned back to her legal pad. She called Renata Voss that afternoon from the east parking exit, and Voss called back 40 minutes later with a meeting confirmed for the following morning at a law office 3 blocks from Whitestone's headquarters. Neutral ground, attorney-client privilege, secure. Ethan spent the afternoon on his regular rounds, doing his job, logging his work, speaking to the people he normally spoke to. He fixed a stuck fire door on the 22nd floor. He replaced a ballast in the ceiling of a restroom on floor 30. He ate a vending machine granola bar at 2 p.m. because he'd missed lunch and his stomach had started making its opinions known. At 4:30, he checked his prepaid phone and found a text from Victoria. Voss is bringing Oduya. Croft is traveling but available by secure video. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. He replied, Good. Be careful tonight. Her response, You too. He put the phone back in his pocket and went to service a pressure gauge on the building's east water riser. At 5:47 p.m., the situation changed again. He was in the utility corridor on the 32nd floor when he heard footsteps. Not unusual, people use the wrong door sometimes, ended up in places they shouldn't be. But these footsteps were deliberate, and they stopped just around the corner from where he was. And then he heard a voice he recognized. Sandra Fitch. She was on the phone. Her voice was low, but the corridor carried sound in ways that worked against her. Doesn't matter how she got it. What matters is she's meeting with Voss tomorrow, which means she has something. A pause. I don't know how. That's what I'm telling you. Another pause, then sharper. Then we accelerate. Move the vote up. If we can get the executive committee to call an emergency session. The voice on the other end was inaudible, too quiet, but Fitch's responses told the story. Yes. Tonight if possible. I'll get the documentation to you by 8 p.m. A pause. She doesn't have the votes without the independent directors, and if we move before they can respond to whatever she brings Voss tomorrow. Silence. Then, understood. The footsteps moved away. Ethan stood perfectly still until they were gone, then took out his notebook and wrote down the time, the location, and every word he'd heard. They were going to try to move the vote up. Call an emergency executive committee session, use the pre-rigged procedural machinery to push the merger through before Voss and the other independent directors could respond to whatever Victoria brought them tomorrow morning. He needed to call her, but not from here. Not from a building where the wrong corridor had just demonstrated exactly how sound traveled. He finished his work ticket with hands that were completely steady. He logged out at his normal time. He walked out through the service entrance, nodded to Rourke, walked half a block from the building, and called Victoria on the prepaid. She picked up immediately. I was about to call you. What happened? Garrett. He went to the vault. I don't know if he found anything, but one of the administrative assistants on 46 told me she's not connected to any of this. She just talks to me when we're in the same space. She told me Garrett had an urgent call with Hale at 4 p.m. and came out of the conference room looking like someone had changed the game on him. They know we're moving, Ethan said, or they suspect. Same result. He told her what he'd heard from Fitch in the corridor. She was quiet through all of it, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment more. If they move the vote up to tonight or tomorrow morning, the meeting with Voss becomes irrelevant. The merger goes through before the independent directors can invoke their override authority. He paused on the sidewalk, a city moving around him with indifferent momentum. Taxis, pedestrians, the ambient noise of a place that had no idea and no interest in what was happening inside the glass tower behind him. You need to call Voss right now and move the meeting up. To when? Tonight, whatever time she can do it. It's almost 6 p.m. I know what time it is. A beat. She's going to think I'm panicking. Tell her you have reason to believe the vote is being moved up to circumvent the board process. Tell her it has to be tonight. She'll understand what that means. He heard her exhale. Not panic, just the compression of someone taking a large amount of pressure and deciding to carry it rather than put it down. Okay. And Victoria. He stopped walking. Bring everything. The merger documents, my photographs, the transfer records, the notebook documentation. Everything we have. Don't hold anything back as a second option. We don't have a second option. I know. A pause. Where will you be? In the building, he said, where I need to be. He hung up and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the tower. 52 floors of glass and steel and recycled air and the hum of servers that never slept. 3,000 people who showed up every day without knowing that the institution they worked for was being quietly consumed from the inside. He thought about Fitch in that corridor, about Hale in his office, about Garrett now going through the vault document by document trying to understand what had been taken and what it meant. He thought about Victoria in her car somewhere, calling Renata Voss, trying to compress weeks of accumulated evidence into a phone call that had to be persuasive without being hysterical, clear without being complete, urgent without triggering the wrong kind of alarm. He thought about Sophie, currently at his sister's place, probably asleep by now, her yellow raincoat hanging on a hook she could actually reach, no napkin notes to write until tomorrow morning. Then he turned back toward the building's service entrance, badged himself back in, and went to work. The night was going to be long, and the building had a lot of corridors, and Ethan Cross knew every single one of them. Renata Voss agreed to meet at 9 p.m. Victoria texted Ethan the confirmation at 6:41, and he read it in the stairwell on the building's north side, where he'd positioned himself after badging back in, not because he had a specific plan yet, but because being inside the building was better than being outside it, and the stairwell gave him sightlines to the badge reader log terminal on his phone's maintenance app, which updated in real time whenever someone accessed a secured area. He watched the log. At 7:15, Garrett's badge appeared on the 46th floor. At 7:22, Hale's badge appeared on the same floor. At 7:31, Fitch. 3 of them together in the vault corridor on the night before the scheduled merger vote, after Sandra Fitch had been overheard on the phone saying they needed to accelerate. Ethan photographed the log screen and texted it to Victoria without comment. Her response came back in under a minute. I see it. Leaving for Voss now. Be careful. He put the phone away and sat with what he had. 3 people in the vault, aware or nearly aware that something had been compromised, trying to determine their next move. The merger vote scheduled for 10 a.m. the following morning. Voss meeting Victoria at 9 p.m. with enough evidence to potentially invoke independent director override authority. But that process required formal notice to the full board, a minimum of 12 hours advance, which meant even if Voss was fully persuaded tonight, the procedural machinery for stopping the vote legally ran right up against the wall of the scheduled start time. It was going to be close. Too close for comfort, and Ethan Cross had never been someone who confused discomfort with impossibility. He spent the next hour and a half doing what he was paid to do. There was a genuine fault in the emergency lighting circuit on floors 40 through 42 that he'd been tracking all week, and he worked it methodically, junction box by junction box, tracing the intermittent ground fault until he found it in a corroded connector inside a ceiling panel on 41. He replaced the connector, tested the circuit, logged the repair. His hands knew this work without needing his full attention, which left the rest of him free to think. The core problem was timing. Even if Voss, Oduya, and Croft moved immediately after the 9 p.m. meeting, the formal board notification process was public. It went through the company's legal infrastructure, which Sandra Fitch sat inside. The moment Fitch saw the notification, she would tell Hale, and Hale would know the independent directors had been activated, and whatever countermove they had prepared for exactly this scenario would come down. There had to be a way to remove Fitch from the communication chain. Ethan finished the 41st floor repair and sat on the top step of the maintenance stairwell with his notebook open, thinking. The legal and compliance team's internal communication system routed through the main corporate server on the 44th floor, the same server infrastructure he had legitimate maintenance access to through the power management interface. The system itself he couldn't touch, but the physical infrastructure it ran on was another question. He thought about this carefully, the way he'd been trained to think about problems that had to be solved without creating worse problems. Not disruption. Disruption left fingerprints and raised alarms and was, fundamentally, the kind of response that told the other side something had changed. He needed something narrower, something that created a delay, a gap in the flow of information, without announcing itself. The answer was sitting in his maintenance log from 2 weeks ago, where he documented an intermittent network switch failure in the secondary communications rack on the 44th floor, a failure he'd flagged to IT, who had deprioritized it because the primary system had redundancy. The switch didn't go down completely. It degraded. When it was in a degraded state, certain low-priority internal communications, routing notifications, automated system alerts, background information distribution, queued instead of transmitting, sometimes for 30 to 40 minutes, sometimes longer. He could induce that degradation, not by breaking anything, by doing what the maintenance documentation already authorized, running a diagnostic cycle on the failing switch, which was standard procedure, and which would temporarily reduce the switch's throughput while the diagnostic ran. 30 to 40 minutes of degraded internal communications during the window when Voss's formal notice would be transmitted. Enough time for the board notification to be filed, distributed to the independent directors, and acknowledged before Fitch's monitoring system surfaced it. It wasn't a clean solution. There was no clean solution, but it was defensible. He had documentation showing the switch had been failing for 2 weeks, and running a diagnostic on a failing component was exactly what a maintenance technician was supposed to do. He made the decision, wrote it in his notebook with the time and his reasoning, because he was the kind of person who documented his own choices as carefully as he documented everything else. Then he went to find the 44th floor switch. At 8:47 p.m., while Victoria Sterling was sitting in a private conference room 3 blocks away, watching Renata Voss and Philip Oduya read through 432 pages of merger documentation with the focused, increasingly grim attention of 2 people watching a building burn, Ethan was in the secondary communications rack on the 44th floor, running a diagnostic on a failing network switch. The diagnostic took 11 minutes to initialize. While it ran, he sat on a cable management rail and looked at his phone. His sister had sent a photo 20 minutes ago. Sophie asleep on the couch, still wearing her shoes, her small face completely slack and unguarded in the way that children's faces were when they weren't performing anything. His sister had added a caption, conked out at 8:15. She made the dog sit before bed, like the dog actually sat. He looked at that photo for a long time. He thought about the fact that Sophie didn't know what he was doing in this building tonight. She knew he worked late sometimes. She knew his job was to fix things that were broken. She had, at age 6, explained his job to a classmate's parent at a school event by saying her dad made buildings work right, which was the most accurate description anyone had ever given of what he did in either of his careers. She didn't know about the other career. She was 8. There was time for that conversation, and also the possibility that the right version of that conversation might be to never have it, to let her know him only as the person he'd chosen to be rather than the person training and circumstance had made him. He hadn't decided. He turned it over sometimes, late at night, without resolution. The diagnostic finished. The switch, as anticipated, was running at reduced throughput, about 60% of normal capacity, which was enough to keep critical systems functioning while queuing lower priority distribution traffic. He logged the diagnostic in the maintenance system, noted the component's continued degradation, and recommended scheduled replacement. He left the 44th floor and went to wait. Victoria called him at 10:23 p.m. Voss and Oduya are in, she said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who had been running on adrenaline for hours and had just received news that didn't fully release the tension, just changed its shape. Croft reviewed the summary document by video. He's in. They're filing the formal notice for an emergency full board session at 6 a.m. tomorrow. It goes to every board member simultaneously, including the executive committee. What does that do to the merger vote? Under the board charter, an active emergency session notice from 3 or more independent directors automatically postpones any scheduled vote until the session has concluded. Hale can't convene the vote without quorum, and quorum requires the full board. She paused. He's going to fight it. He'll claim the notice is procedurally irregular. He'll try to get it invalidated. Will he succeed? Not if the documentation we gave Voss holds up. Renata has outside counsel reviewing it tonight. She says she's never seen anything this comprehensive from a non-forensic source. The pause that followed was shorter, quieter. She asked to put this together. I told her it was a collaborative effort. That's accurate. She's going to want to know more, at some point. I know, he said, one thing at a time. He was in the mechanical room on the basement level, sitting at his work table with his notebook open and nothing written in it yet. He'd been waiting to see how the night resolved before adding to the record. He picked up his pen now and began writing. Date, time, Voss confirmed. Formal notice to be filed at 0600. Ethan. Her voice shifted register. Not softer exactly, but more direct, the way it got when she was saying something she'd thought about rather than something she was processing in real time. I need you to understand something. Okay? When this goes public tomorrow, and it will go public, there's no version of this that stays quiet. Your name is going to come out. The vault access, the server room, maybe not immediately, but it will come out. I know. I'm going to stand behind every decision I made in this process, including the decision to work with you, including the decision to use information you obtained. A beat. But I can't speak to what you did before I knew you were doing it. The 14 months before our first conversation, that documentation exists independently of me. I understand. He did understand. She wasn't distancing herself. She was being precise, which was her nature and which he respected. The 14 months is all observation, camera rerouting, access logs, overheard conversations. Nothing I did during that period was unauthorized. I was doing my job and I noticed things that my job gave me access to notice. And the vault. That's different. Yes. She was quiet. I want you to have a lawyer before tomorrow morning. He hadn't thought about this. He recognized it as a gap, the kind of gap that opened up when you were inside an operation and focused on execution and forgot that operations had aftermaths. I'll figure it out. I've already spoken to Renata's outside counsel. They can provide a referral tonight if you want it. Someone who is completely independent of this company. She paused. You don't have to decide right now, but I wanted you to have the option. He sat with that. The fact of it, that she'd thought about his exposure before he had, that she'd already moved to address it, had an unexpected weight to it. Tell me the name, he said. She gave him a name and a number. He wrote it in his notebook, on the same page as the merger vote notation, and looked at it for a moment. Go home, she said. There's nothing more you can do tonight that matters more than being rested for tomorrow. What about you? I'm going home too. A pause. After I sit in this parking lot for another 20 minutes and remind myself how to breathe. He almost smiled at that. You've been breathing fine. Faking it covers a lot of ground. She said it without self-pity, just the flat acknowledgement of someone who had been performing composure for 2 weeks and was aware of the performance. Tomorrow is going to be bad before it gets better. Yeah, he said. Most things are. He drove home. He sat in his parking space for a moment before going up, looking at the building where he and Sophie lived. 7 stories of ordinary brick and ordinary windows with ordinary lights on in some of them, and thought about how much of his life had been deliberately, carefully ordinary for the past 4 years, and how strange it was to have that ordinary life intersect with something this large. He went upstairs. He ate toast standing at the kitchen counter because it was late and he wasn't hungry enough for anything else. He looked at Sophie's school project, still on the kitchen table, the forest floor ecosystem, finished now, with a small paper sign that said Decomposers, important, in her handwriting. He thought about what he'd told her. Most important things are both. He went to bed. He slept because he'd always been able to sleep before a hard day, which was one of the things his training had given him that was unambiguously useful. At 6:14 a.m., his phone woke him. Not a call. The building management system alert, which routed to his personal phone as well as his work phone because he was the on-call overnight facilities contact. The alert was from the 46th floor security desk. Unscheduled access, multiple badge entries, executive conference suite. He was dressed in 4 minutes. He called Victoria on the prepaid while he drove. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. I saw it, she said before he could speak. They're in the building. Hale, Garrett, Fitch, and 2 people I don't recognize from the badge IDs. They're not Whitestone employees. The 2 unknowns were the variable he didn't like. What time did the emergency session notice go out? 6 a.m. as planned, but Ethan, Hale's already responded. I just got a notification from the board secretary that he's filed a challenge to the notice, claiming it doesn't meet the charter's procedural threshold. He's trying to get it invalidated before it takes effect. Can he do that? Not unilaterally, but he needs a majority of the executive committee to concur with his challenge, and he has 3 of the 5 members. The challenge hearing is supposed to go before the full executive committee at 9 a.m. She paused. The merger vote is at 10 a.m. He only needs to delay the emergency session long enough. Ethan pulled into the parking structure on the building's east side. He's buying time. The people in the building right now. They're there to control the physical space before anything public happens. The 2 unknown badge holders. Her voice had an edge he hadn't heard from her before. Not fear, something closer to anger. The particular anger of someone who had played every move carefully and was now watching the other side change the rules of the board. They have corporate contractor credentials, security contractor credentials, private security. Brought in under a contractor designation so they'd have legitimate building access without appearing on any official Whitestone staffing record. It was a clean move. If you were preparing to physically manage a situation, isolate a CEO, control access to a conference room, ensure a vote went forward despite procedural challenges, you needed people who were authorized to be there and who answered to you. Don't come to the building through the main entrance, Ethan said. He was out of his car, moving through the parking structure toward the east service door. Come through the same east parking exit I walked you through before. I'll be at the door. Ethan, if they have security contractors, I've worked alongside worse, he said. Come through the east exit. 20 minutes. He hung up and went into the building. That's it. The next 4 hours were the most precise and demanding work Ethan Cross had done in 4 years. Not violent. That needed to be understood. None of what he did in those 4 hours involved anything that would look, on a surveillance tape, like anything other than a maintenance technician doing his job under unusually complicated circumstances. But it required the same quality of attention, the same moment-to-moment assessment of a shifting environment, the same capacity for making irrevocable decisions quickly and without the luxury of certainty. The skills didn't care about context. They worked in a corporate building the same way they worked anywhere else. He met Victoria at the East Service door at 6:51. She was wearing the kind of deliberately anonymous clothes that suggested she'd thought about not being immediately recognizable, dark coat, no corporate insignia, and she had her bag over one shoulder with the weight of someone carrying documents. The emergency session materials, he asked. Copy of everything. Voss has the originals in her counsel's office. She looked at him with the direct, assessing attention that had characterized every interaction they'd had from the beginning. What's the plan? The executive committee challenge hearing is at 9 a.m. in the main boardroom on 50. Hale needs a majority vote to invalidate the emergency session notice. If we can get you into that room with Voss, Oduya, and Croft before 9 a.m., you have 3 independent directors who can make an oral record of their objection to the challenge, which under the charter creates an automatic adjudication delay. It goes to external legal review, which takes the decision out of Hale's hands entirely. That buys how much time? Minimum 72 hours. Enough for the forensic review of the evidence to be completed by external counsel and submitted to the full board. And the merger vote can't proceed during an active adjudication. Not legally, Ethan said. She absorbed this. How do we get to the boardroom? If there are security contractors controlling access to the executive floors. We don't use the executive floors. He picked up his toolbox. We use the building. He took her through the route he'd mapped in his head on the drive in. The maintenance stairwell on the north side to floor 48. A horizontal utility corridor that connected to the building's secondary ventilation access on the same level. Then a short vertical climb through an equipment shaft. Not glamorous, not comfortable, and Victoria in her dark coat did it without complaint and without asking unnecessary questions. To the mechanical access point on the 51st floor, one floor above the main boardroom level. From 51, a service staircase that he'd used 6 months ago to address a ceiling fixture issue in the boardroom antechamber connected directly to the room's maintenance corridor. He had a legitimate work order for that space, a fluorescent ballast replacement he'd never quite gotten around to closing, and his badge would open the service door without triggering the secondary security layer that the contractors were managing. This is the part where I have to do something that is not maintaining a building, he said, outside the service door. What part? I need to send a simultaneous transmission to Voss, Oduya, and Croft with the building's internal broadcast system. It's normally used for fire drills and all staff emergency announcements. If I trigger it from the building management interface, it goes to every connected device in the building at the same time, which includes the board members' company phones, regardless of which floor they're on. He held her gaze. I'm not authorized to use it for non-emergency purposes. She looked at him steadily. Is this an emergency? I think that's your call to make. A pause. She squared her shoulders, not performatively, just the physical settling of a person taking on weight they'd decided to carry. Do it. He opened the maintenance interface on his phone, navigated to the emergency broadcast module, and composed a message that was brief, specific, and contained a single instruction. Boardroom antechamber, 50th floor, by 8:45 a.m., for formal objection to the Executive Committee challenge notice. It went out at 7:42 a.m. to every active board member's company device, including, unavoidably, Hale's. There was no way around that, but the moment it transmitted, it created a documented record of an official board-level communication, time-stamped and logged in the system, which meant the independent director's presence at the antechamber was now part of the formal record, regardless of what Hale did to object to it. He could feel the clock moving from that moment. Hale would know within minutes. The two security contractors would receive new instructions. Whatever the next move was, it was going to come fast. He opened the service door and brought Victoria through. Renata Voss arrived at 8:39. Philip Oduya was with her, and behind them, with the slightly disoriented air of someone who had driven very fast from a significant distance, was James Croft, who was 61 years old, still wearing what appeared to be yesterday's shirt, and who shook Victoria's hand with a grip that communicated, without any words, that he had read everything and understood it completely. Ethan was in the anteroom's maintenance corridor, one wall away. He could hear the conversation through the same acoustic carry that had given him Hale's conversation 14 months ago. He wasn't recording it. He didn't need to. What was happening in that room was legitimate board business, conducted by legitimate board members, and it would generate its own documented record. He heard Voss's voice, level and precise, citing the charter provision under which the objection was being made. He heard Croft say something about external forensic review. He heard Oduya say the words securities fraud in the flat, serious tone of someone who had moved from suspicion to conviction. At 8:57, the door to the antechamber opened. Ethan heard this from the corridor and understood what it meant before the voices confirmed it. Someone had come in through the main access. He pressed against the corridor wall and listened. A voice he didn't know. One of the contractors, almost certainly, from the flat professional tone of it. Ms. Voss, this area is restricted pending the Executive Committee session. Renata Voss, without any audible change in register. I'm a member of this board. I'm not restricted from any area in this building. Step aside. A pause. I have instructions from Mr. Hale. Mr. Hale does not give instructions to independent board directors. Her voice was absolutely, almost impressively cold. I don't know who employed you or under what terms, but if you place a hand on me or anyone in this room, you will have committed battery against a sitting board member of a publicly traded company in front of 4 witnesses. I'd recommend you think carefully about the next 30 seconds. Silence. Ethan had his hand on the corridor door handle. He was ready to come through it if the silence ended wrong. It didn't. The sound of footsteps withdrawing. He released the door handle. At 9:04, Hale arrived. Ethan heard his voice, initially controlled, then progressively less so, as the reality of what was in that room assembled itself in front of him. Not one rebellious CEO, but 3 independent board directors, a legal representative Voss had brought, a formal objection to his challenge already delivered in writing to the board secretary, and Victoria Sterling standing in the middle of it with 14 months of documented evidence behind her. This is irregular, Hale said. This entire process is perfectly regular, Voss said, as your own legal counsel will confirm when you call them, which I suggest you do. A pause. Marcus, look at what's in this room. Look at what we have, and then make whatever decision you're going to make. A long silence. Ethan counted it. 11 seconds. You have nothing that isn't compromised, Hale said finally. The control in his voice had developed a crack. Not much. Enough. Chain of custody. How this was obtained. None of it is admissible. This isn't a courtroom, Oduya said. This is a board. And what we have is sufficient for us to invoke our authority and refer the matter to the SEC and the DOJ, which will generate their own investigation through their own channels and with their own subpoena authority. He paused. You've been doing this for 4 years, Marcus. A federal investigation will find it. Another silence. Shorter this time. Garrett's voice from somewhere near the door. Ethan hadn't heard him come in, which meant he'd been there already, waiting. Marcus, we should call counsel. Yes, Hale said. His voice had gone flat in a way that was different from control. It was the flatness of a person who had started calculating an exit rather than a victory. We should. The room began to move. Voices shifted, positions changed, the contained drama of 9 people in a corporate anteroom who all understood that something had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Ethan stayed in the corridor and didn't move. At 9:21, his prepaid phone buzzed. Victoria, we have it. They're calling their lawyers. Emergency session formally invoked. Merger vote suspended pending adjudication. Come out. He stood in the maintenance corridor for a moment longer, in the particular quiet of a situation that is broken rather than resolved. Not finished, not clean, but irreversibly changed. Then he opened the door and walked into the antechamber. They all looked at him. Voss, Oduya, Croft, Victoria, the legal representative whose name he didn't know. And across the room, already moving toward the main exit, Hale, who stopped when he saw Ethan, saw the gray coveralls, the toolbox, the face of the maintenance worker he had passed in corridors for 3 years without ever actually seeing. Something moved across Hale's face. Not shame. It was too early for shame, and shame might never come. But something that looked like the specific, unpleasant recognition of a man understanding exactly how thoroughly and how quietly he'd been outmaneuvered, and by whom. Ethan met his eyes. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed to be said. Hale left. Garrett followed. The contractors, after a moment of apparent uncertainty about whose authority they now answered to, followed as well. Renata Voss crossed the room and stood in front of Ethan. She was 63 years old, sharp-featured, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people underestimated her and had long since stopped finding it either surprising or interesting. She looked at him the way he'd been looked at by people who were reassessing something. "You're the maintenance technician," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Victoria told me some of what you did. Not all of it, I think." She studied him. "You spent 14 months on this." "Yes." "Why?" It was the same question Victoria had asked him weeks ago in room 4B, and he still didn't have a better answer than the one he'd given then. "I noticed something wrong. I don't do well with leaving wrong things alone." Voss looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "I imagine you don't." She offered her hand and he shook it, and that was all that passed between them, But it was the kind of handshake that meant something. Not gratitude exactly, something more like acknowledgement of a thing that didn't have a clean word for it. Victoria was at his shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The federal referral was filed by noon. By 2 p.m., the SEC had acknowledged receipt and flagged the matter for expedited review. By 4 p.m., Whitestone Dynamics legal department, the parts of it that weren't connected to Fitch, was fielding calls from two different federal agencies. Ethan spent the afternoon writing a complete, detailed account of every action he'd taken over the preceding 14 months, organized chronologically, with source citations for every piece of documentation. He did it in the maintenance room in the basement, at his work table, with his notebook open beside him and his coffee going cold. He gave the complete document to the lawyer whose name Victoria had given him, who drove to the building at 5 p.m., reviewed it in 90 minutes, and told him it was the most thorough self-documented account she had ever seen from a non-attorney. Most people in your position, she said, would have been much less careful. I'm careful about things that matter, he said. At 6:30 p.m., he picked up Sophie from his sister's place. She threw herself at him when he came through the door, with the complete physical abandon that children had before they learned self-consciousness. And he caught her and held on, and she said into his shoulder, "The dog sat twice more today." And he said, "I heard," and she pulled back and looked at his face with the direct, slightly uncomfortable perceptiveness that she'd always had. "You look tired," she said. "Had a long day. Did you fix something?" He thought about that, about what the word meant. "Yeah," he said, "I think we did." She accepted this with the equanimity of a child who'd long since made peace with not being given all the details, and told him she wanted pasta, and he said fine, and they went home. The federal investigation took 4 months. That was the part nobody outside of it fully understood. How long it took, how grinding and methodical and unglamorous the actual work of accountability was once the dramatic morning in the boardroom antechamber had passed. There was no single moment of justice arriving like weather. It came in increments, in document requests, and depositions, and forensic accounting reviews that generated reports nobody outside a regulatory agency would ever read in full. It came in the particular bureaucratic language of charging documents and consent orders and plea agreements that reduced 4 years of sophisticated fraud to numbered paragraphs in legal filings. Ethan followed it the way he followed most things, methodically, without expecting it to feel the way he'd imagined it might. He cooperated fully with the SEC investigation, providing every photograph, every notebook entry, every piece of documentation he'd accumulated over 14 months, delivered through his attorney in organized chronological files that the lead investigator later described, in a moment of genuine surprise, as the clearest pre-investigation record she'd encountered from a private individual. His attorney, whose name was Diane Kwan, and who had the particular quality of someone who had seen enough of human behavior to be unsurprised by most of it, told him in their third meeting that the vault access issue was going to require careful handling. "What you did was unauthorized," she said without judgment. "How it gets characterized depends partly on the overall context and partly on how the federal investigation proceeds. If the documents you obtained are what leads to a successful prosecution, there's an argument that the public interest weighs heavily in your favor. And if it doesn't go that way, then we deal with it." She looked at him over her reading glasses with the steady attention of someone who charged by the hour and chose her words accordingly. "You kept very good records, Mr. Cross. That helps." "I kept records because I thought they might matter someday." "They matter," she said, "more than you know." He went back to work. This was the part that surprised people who knew the story later, that he continued showing up at Whitestone Dynamics every morning through the entire investigation, badging through the service entrance, taking the work orders, fixing the things that needed fixing. The building didn't stop needing maintenance because its executive floor had become a federal matter. Elevator 3 finally got its replacement part in the second week of the investigation, which Ethan installed on a Wednesday morning with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been waiting on a parts queue for 6 weeks and was simply glad to close the ticket. He ate lunch in the maintenance room. He packed Sophie's bag in the mornings and found her napkin notes in his wallet in the evenings, and helped her with homework that was increasingly beyond the point where he could help without looking things up himself, which she found deeply satisfying in a way she didn't bother to conceal. The building felt different those months, not dramatically. It wasn't haunted or heavy or transformed, but the 46th floor was quieter, The executive suite had a provisional quality, people moving through it with the careful awareness of a space whose authority structure had been disrupted and not yet reestablished. There were new faces, interim appointments, outside administrators brought in by the board to manage operations during the investigation. They passed Ethan in the corridors the same way everyone passed him. They didn't know who he was, which was still exactly how he preferred it. Marcus Hale was indicted on 11 counts in the third month. Paul Garrett took a plea agreement in the fourth, which was a decision that surprised people who knew him and didn't surprise people who understood that when the full architecture of something is exposed, the ones who built the middle floors rather than the foundation tend to look for the fastest way to a negotiated outcome. Sandra Fitch resigned her position 2 days after the indictments were filed and was subsequently charged separately for her role in the communications manipulation that had been used to isolate Victoria. The acquiring company, the entity on the other side of the fraudulent merger, was a more complicated matter that generated its own parallel investigation across 2 jurisdictions and took considerably longer to resolve. Ethan followed it in the financial press, which covered it with the particular appetite that corporate fraud cases generated. The combination of large numbers, institutional betrayal, and the implicit reassurance that sophisticated wrongdoing had been caught and was being punished. What the financial press mostly didn't cover, because it didn't fit neatly into the narrative of institutional failure, was the maintenance technician. Some outlets picked up fragments of it. A detail in a longer piece about the SEC investigation mentioned that the initial documentation had been compiled by a building employee without specifics. One profile of Victoria Sterling, published in a business magazine 4 months after the boardroom warning, described her unlikely alliance with a facilities worker as one element of a larger story about corporate whistleblowing. It used the word unlikely 3 times in 2 paragraphs, which Ethan noticed and which he thought was a slightly lazy way of framing something that was only unlikely if you had a particular set of assumptions about who noticed things and who acted on them. He didn't reach out to correct the record. That wasn't the point. Victoria called him on a Tuesday evening in the 5th month, after the last of the major indictments had been publicly confirmed. He was in his kitchen, supervising Sophie's attempt to make scrambled eggs, which was going better than the previous attempt and worse than it would eventually go. The board voted this afternoon, Victoria said. Formal reinstatement of my authority. Full vote, no objections from the executive committee, which has 3 new members as of today. Congratulations, he said. Don't do that. Do what? Make it sound smaller than it is just because you're not comfortable with the big version. A pause. We won, Ethan. The fraud is being prosecuted. The merger is dead. The company is still standing. And the people who built this over 4 years are going to spend a significant portion of their remaining careers in federal court. That matters. He watched Sophie push eggs around the pan with a spatula. She had her tongue between her teeth, concentrating. It does matter, he said. I know it does. I want to offer you something, formally, this time through the proper channels with the proper paperwork. She paused, and he could hear her choosing her words. Victoria Sterling was always choosing her words, but she chose them differently now than she had in room 4B, with less performance and more directness. Director of Corporate Security. It's a new position. The board created it last week. Full executive authority over physical and digital security infrastructure, strategic threat assessment, internal investigations protocol. It reports directly to the CEO's office. Another pause. To me. He was quiet. I know you're going to want to think about it, she said. I'm thinking about it right now. And? Sophie looked up from the eggs. Dad, are they done? Turn the heat down a little. He looked at the eggs. They're almost done. Keep going. She turned back to the stove. He watched her for a moment. The small, serious figure of her. Her hair slightly messy the way it always was by evening. Her attention on the pan with the complete commitment that she brought to new things she'd decided to master. The job, he said into the phone. What does it actually require? You. What you already are. What you've been doing for 14 months without a title or a salary that reflected it. He could hear the slight shift in her voice. Not quite warmth, but something adjacent to it. The professional distance giving way to the version of her that existed in mechanical rooms and service corridors and parking structures where she was just a person trying to figure out what she was doing. You see things. You notice what's wrong, and you don't leave it alone. You know how this building works from the inside out. That's not something I can hire from outside, Ethan. That's something that took 3 years of showing up every day and paying attention. He thought about the service entrance, the maintenance room, the notebook in his jacket pocket, the specific satisfaction of closing a work ticket on a component that had been failing for weeks. He also thought about the 46th floor vault and the diagnostic he'd run on the network switch, and the emergency broadcast he'd sent without authorization, and the fact that he was still, 4 months later, waiting to fully understand the legal shape of those decisions. The vault access, he said, it's still unresolved. My legal team has been in conversation with Diane Kwan. The SEC's position, off the record, not officially, but their position, is that the vault documentation was substantially corroborated by independent investigation and that the public interest served by the overall outcome weighs heavily in the assessment of individual conduct. She paused. It's not a guarantee, but it's the direction things are moving. And you want to hire someone with an open legal question. I want to hire someone I trust. She said it simply, without the executive wrapper. That's actually pretty rare in my experience. He was quiet again. Outside the kitchen window, the city made its usual sounds. Traffic, distance, the ambient hum of a large place full of people managing their own complications. Sophie slid the eggs onto a plate and looked at them with the critical assessment of someone who knew they weren't quite right but was willing to accept the result. They're a little brown, she said. Still eggs, Ethan said. That's a low bar. Most important bars are low. You clear them every day. She looked at him with the slightly suspicious expression she had when she thought he was saying something wise at her. Are you on the phone? Yeah. Is it work? He looked at the eggs on her plate, at the pan she'd set aside, at the small evidence of a thing she'd decided to try and then done. Kind of, he said. He told Victoria he'd give her an answer by the end of the week. She said that was fine, and that she'd have the formal offer letter ready whenever he wanted it. They said goodnight in the way that people who had been through something together said goodnight, without excess, but with the particular weight of shared experience underneath the ordinary words. He ate scrambled eggs with his daughter and told her they were good, which was almost true, and she told him she knew they needed work, which was entirely true. He took the job. Not because it was more money, although it was, substantially. Not because it was a title, which he found mostly useful in that it meant people in the building would now look at him when he walked by, which he was going to have to get used to. He took it because Victoria had been right about one thing in a very direct way. The work he'd been doing for 14 months was the work. Noticing what was wrong, following it without knowing where it led, staying with it through the months of slow accumulation when nothing dramatic was happening and the dramatic outcome wasn't visible yet. He'd been doing that work without any official standing and without any resources except his own access and his own judgment, and he'd done it reasonably well, but there were limits to what one person with a notebook and a prepaid phone could cover in a 52-story building. A formal position meant structure, resources, proper protocols for doing what he'd done informally. And it meant the next person who noticed something wrong in this building would have somewhere official to bring it. That mattered to him more than the title. He negotiated one condition. He kept his maintenance credentials active. Not as a job function, the maintenance team had their own structure, and his new role didn't overlap with it, but as a technical access classification. He wanted to be able to walk into any mechanical room, any utility corridor, any equipment shaft in the building without needing to explain himself or request special clearance. Victoria, when he made this request, was quiet for a moment and then said she didn't see why that would be a problem, and she would put it in the offer letter. You just want to be able to keep fixing things, she said. Things break, he said. Somebody's got to know where the problem is. He started in the new role on a Monday, which was 6 months after the morning in the boardroom antechamber. He wore the same kind of clothes he'd always worn, not the coveralls, since that was no longer his daily uniform, but nothing that announced itself. Dark slacks, a plain shirt, the jacket with the inside pocket where the notebook had lived. He still carried the notebook. Diane Kwan had suggested, gently, that the habit of documentation was one he should probably maintain indefinitely, and he didn't need much persuading. He spent the first 2 weeks doing what he would have done in any new environment, walking it. Not the floors he knew, the maintenance infrastructure, the mechanical rooms and service corridors. The other floors. The spaces he'd had legitimate reasons to be in before but hadn't mapped with the same attention. The data center on the 9th floor. The HR archive on 16. the executive dining room on 47, which he'd serviced the ventilation for a dozen times but had never sat in. He sat in it for lunch on his third day, which felt strange in a way he suspected would eventually become ordinary. The building looked the same from inside it. Same recycled air, same low server hum, same glass and steel, and the daily circulation of 3,000 people who showed up and did their work without knowing most of what sustained the place they worked in. The investigation had changed specific people and specific structures, but it hadn't changed the fundamental texture of how a large institution operated, which was to say, mostly through the accumulated effort of people who went unnoticed. Ethan had spent 4 years being one of those people. I wasn't entirely sure yet what it meant to be something else, or whether the something else he was now would change in any fundamental way the thing he actually was. He thought it probably wouldn't. He hoped it wouldn't. The version of himself that he trusted, the one who paid attention, who documented, who didn't leave wrong things alone, who folded napkin notes into his wallet, that version had always been independent of job titles. It predated the title he'd had before the maintenance work. It would probably survive this one too. The board held a formal recognition event in the 8th month. Renata Voss organized it, a private board dinner, nothing public, in the executive dining room on 47. Victoria had asked Ethan about it beforehand with the careful courtesy of someone who understood that public recognition and private recognition were different things for different people. "You don't have to come," she said. "I know. Renata wants to formally acknowledge what you did. For the record. The board record." "Why?" A pause. "Because it matters that someone did it. And because if it's not on record, the story of what happened here becomes a story about corporate fraud and federal investigation, which is accurate but incomplete." She said this without sentimentality. It was an argument, clearly constructed. The complete story includes the fact that this was caught because one person noticed something wrong and spent 14 months making sure it could be proven. That's a different kind of story. He thought about this for a few days. He thought about what she meant by different kind of story. Whether she meant it mattered for the company's public narrative, which it did, or whether she meant something smaller and more honest, which was that some things deserved to be seen because people needed to know they were possible. He went to the dinner. Sophie asked, when he was putting on his jacket to leave, where he was going. He told her a work dinner. She asked if he was going to have to shake hands with people, which she knew he found faintly tedious, and he said probably. She told him to not look like it bothered him when he shook hands. He told her she was 8 and had opinions about everything. She said she had opinions about things she'd observed carefully, which was a distinction. He drove to the building. He took the elevator, elevator 3, which had been running perfectly for 6 months on its new cable tensioner, to the 47th floor. The dinner was 12 people, the full board: Victoria, Diane Kwan, and Ethan. It was a private space, a round table, no press, no ceremony beyond the fact of being there. Renata Voss gave a brief statement, not a speech, she was too pragmatic for speeches, in which she said that the board wanted to formally acknowledge, for the institutional record, that the integrity of Whitestone Dynamics had been preserved in part because of the sustained, principled action of an individual who had no obligation to take that action and significant personal risk in doing so. She looked at Ethan when she said it. Everyone at the table looked at Ethan. He sat with it, the specific discomfort of being seen clearly, which was different from, and in some ways harder, than being overlooked. "I want to say something," Philip Oduya said from across the table. He was in his mid-50s, with the patient authority of someone who'd served on enough boards to know the difference between institutional language and human language. "Not for the record, just personally." He looked at Ethan. "Most people who notice something wrong at work decide it's not their problem. The reasons for that are usually understandable: risk, uncertainty, the belief that someone else will handle it, the accurate understanding that handling it personally will cost them something." He paused. "You decided it was your problem 14 months before anyone else knew there was a problem. I'd like to know why." Ethan looked at him. He'd been asked this question, in various forms, several times now, by Victoria, by Diane Kwan, by the SEC investigator who'd conducted his formal interview, by his sister, who'd asked it most directly of all on the phone the week after the boardroom morning. His answer had been consistent, because it was true, and because he didn't have a more complicated one. "I don't know that there's a reason I can explain cleanly," he said. "I noticed something that didn't fit. And I've spent enough time in environments where people ignored things that didn't fit because the cost of paying attention was high. I've seen what happens when that's the default. He paused. I didn't want it to be my default. That's the closest I can get to a reason. Oduya nodded slowly. That's a better answer than most people would give. It's the only one I have. Victoria, from her seat 2 chairs to Ethan's left, said nothing. She'd heard him answer this question before, or some version of it, and she already knew what he was going to say. And she looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by the consistency of a person and had started simply accepting it as a fact of who they were. James Croft, who had barely said 3 words all evening, said, "Is it strange? Working in the same building now in a different capacity?" "A little," Ethan said. "The building's the same." "But you're different." He thought about that. "The job's different. I don't know about me." Croft seemed to accept this. He picked up his wine. The table shifted from formal acknowledgement to something more like dinner, which was the natural evolution of these things, and which everyone seemed relieved by. What Ethan didn't say that evening, what he thought about afterward, driving home, and in the days that followed, was that the honest answer to why was more tangled than the clean version he gave. Some of it was training, which was the unsexy part. The years of being made to pay attention, to document, to follow a thread without knowing where it led, had left him with an orientation toward the world that he couldn't entirely shut off, even when the environment that had trained him was long gone. You didn't stop seeing things just because you'd left the context that had taught you to see them. But some of it was something older and less professional. He'd grown up watching people look away from things that cost them something to look at. His father had looked away from things for 20 years, for reasons that were understandable, and that had cost everyone around him more than they'd cost him. Ethan had made, somewhere in the unsorted archive of becoming an adult, a decision that looking away was going to be the one thing he actively refused to do, not out of courage, which was a word that had always struck him as slightly self-congratulatory, but out of a stubborn conviction that the world was only as wrong as the number of people who saw it clearly and did nothing. He wasn't sure he'd articulate it that way out loud. It sounded, spoken, like something that belonged on a poster rather than inside an actual human being. But it was real. It was the actual thing, underneath all the training and the tactical thinking and the 14 months of careful documentation. It was why he'd started the notebook. It was why, standing in that maintenance corridor, with the sounds of Hale's conversation bleeding through the wall, he'd taken out a pen and written down what he'd heard instead of walking away. He thought about what that had cost him. The vault access, which was still technically unresolved, though Diane Kwan's latest assessment was cautiously optimistic. The months of tension, the nights of insufficient sleep, the particular strain of operating in 2 registers simultaneously, the visible maintenance technician and the invisible person accumulating evidence, while also being a reasonably present father to an 8-year-old who noticed things herself. Sophie had asked him once during the investigation why he seemed distracted. He'd said he had a lot on his mind at work. She'd said okay, and then asked if he wanted to help her practice cursive because she was bad at it, and she thought maybe he could show her because his handwriting was good. He'd sat with her for 40 minutes at the kitchen table, guiding her through capital letters, and he'd felt more grounded at the end of it than he had in weeks. That was the part of his life that the federal investigation and the board dinner and the financial press didn't have a category for. The way that what held you together wasn't dramatic. The way the thing that made the hard work bearable was almost never related to the hard work itself. It was the napkin notes, the scrambled eggs, the dog that had finally learned to sit. He'd been told, more than once in his former career, that people with his background had difficulty with ordinary life, that the gap between what they'd done and what everyday existence required was too wide to cross without residue. He'd believed that for a while. He didn't entirely believe it anymore. Ordinary life, it turned out, had its own kind of difficulty, its own demands and its own weight and its own moments that required everything you had. It was just that nobody gave you a briefing before those moments, and there was no chain of command to report to afterward, and the stakes were sometimes invisible right up until they weren't. He thought that was actually harder. He thought that people who called ordinary life small had never paid close enough attention to it. 6 weeks after the board dinner, Ethan arrived at work on a Thursday morning and found a note on his desk. His new desk, on the 38th floor in the newly established Office of Corporate Security, which still smelled faintly of fresh paint and had a window that looked east over the financial district. The note was handwritten, on standard letterhead, from Victoria. It said, "There's a camera housing on the 43rd floor that's been rerouted to an undisclosed terminal. IT flagged it this morning. Thought you'd want to know. V." He read it twice. He picked up his notebook. He wrote the date, the time, the floor number. Then he put on his jacket and went to find out what was wrong with the 43rd floor camera. Some things didn't change. Some instincts, once developed, became part of the architecture of a person. Structural, load-bearing, not removable without compromising the rest of the structure. The instinct to notice, to follow, to stay with something until it was understood. That had been true in an 11-year career he didn't talk about, and it was true in the 3 years he'd spent in gray coveralls, and it was going to be true in whatever came after this. He took the elevator to 43, stepped out into the corridor, stood for a moment, getting the feel of the floor, the same way he'd always done when he arrived somewhere new. Not dramatically, just the baseline check of a person who'd learned that environments told you things if you bothered to listen. Something was humming slightly wrong in the ventilation above the east corridor. He filed it. He'd get to it. He walked toward the camera housing, notebook in hand, and the building went about its business around him. The daily circulation of 3,000 people who showed up and did their work, most of whom never thought about what held the place together, what kept it honest, what made it possible to trust the ground beneath their feet. That was all right. That had always been all right. Some work was invisible by nature. Some people were built for the kind of effort that didn't announce itself, that accumulated quietly in notebooks and maintenance logs, and early mornings in service corridors where no one was watching. He found the camera housing. He opened his notebook. He began to write. Outside the 43rd floor window, the city was doing what cities did. Enormous, indifferent, full of its own complications, most of them invisible to anyone not looking at the right level. The glass tower caught the morning light and threw it back in pieces, the way glass always did, refracting everything that hit it into something slightly different from what it had been. Somewhere below, in a basement maintenance room, there was a photograph of a girl in a yellow raincoat taped to the edge of a metal shelf. The room belonged to someone else now, but the photograph was still there. Ethan had left it intentionally, not out of sentimentality exactly, but because it seemed right that the room should have something human in it. Something that said a person had been here, had done this work, had cared about what the work was for. He stood at the camera housing on the 43rd floor and did what he had always done. He paid attention. He followed what he found. He wrote it down. The building hummed around him, 10,000 systems running in parallel, most of them working exactly as they should, a few of them not quite right, all of them waiting for someone to notice. He was still that person. He suspected he always would be. That was enough. That had always been enough.